Inside the Los Angeles courtroom, the atmosphere was thick and heavy. All eyes were on the defendant, a 19-year-old young man standing at the defense table, his expression calm and unshaken. Sitting high on the bench, Judge Walter Grayson smirked slightly, tapping his fingers against the desk. Peering down at the teenager through his glasses, his voice carried a hint of mockery. "You think you're a legal expert? This isn't a debate club, kid." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. From the court clerks to the prosecutor and the spectators, everyone saw him as a joke. But Jalen Dawson didn't laugh. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering. They thought he was just another troubled teenager. What they didn't know was that Jalen had spent his entire life studying the law. His mother, Denise Dawson, was a legal assistant. From a young age, he had listened to stories about unjust trials and rigged cases. While his friends were into basketball or video games, Jalen was absorbed in mock trials, arguing with himself. At 14, he could analyze a case like a law student. But none of that mattered to Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another delinquent. Grayson flipped through the case file, skimming the pages as if they were nothing more than a tedious formality. He sighed, shaking his head with boredom, then leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the polished wooden desk. "Let's wrap this up quickly. I have a golf appointment at 2 p.m. A few chuckles sounded from the spectators. Prosecutor Carrington smirked, already confident in an easy win. The court clerk frowned but said nothing, while the officer standing nearby simply shrugged. To all of them, this case required no real thought. A teenager, a stolen car, a police chase. Everything seemed obvious. Just end it quickly, close the case, and move on with their day. But no one paid attention to Jalen's reaction. He didn't look angry. He didn't object. He didn't even appear nervous, like most defendants would after hearing a judge dismiss their case as a trivial nuisance. Instead, Jalen smiled. It wasn't the grin of a reckless fool, nor was it a sign of defiance. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but for anyone who truly paid attention, it was the look of someone who had just spotted his opponent's weakness. Jalen straightened, hands still in his pockets, and locked eyes with Judge Grayson. "You want this over quickly? I'm afraid it won't be as easy as you think." He didn't say it aloud, but his eyes conveyed the message clearly. Grayson had just made his first mistake, and he had no idea. The prosecutor's indictment, a seemingly certain victory. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington stood up, adjusting his expensive suit, his gaze sweeping over the jury with the confidence of a man accustomed to easy victories. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, this case is very simple." His voice rang out, deep and commanding. He picked up a stack of case files, flipping through them slowly. He didn't need to look down. He had already memorized every word of the charges. The defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen Audi A6. When the police ordered him to stop, he attempted to flee, forcing law enforcement to pursue him. Upon inspection of the vehicle, the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. This is irrefutable evidence. Carrington paused briefly, allowing his words to sink into the minds of the jury. A few of them nodded. Others exchanged glances, already forming their conclusions. Stepping forward, Carrington slid his hands into his suit pockets, his measured footsteps echoing against the cold marble floor. He stopped just in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each juror before continuing. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you a simple question." He raised both hands, palms open as if inviting their agreement. "Innocent people don't run, do they?" The question hung in the air like a statement of fact. For a moment, silence filled the courtroom. Then, nods began to appear, one by one. An older juror smacked his lips in thought. A young woman furrowed her brow, as if wondering why this case even needed to be tried. From the back rows, spectators whispered among themselves, murmuring their approval of Carrington's solid argument. A few chuckled, as if the case was too straightforward to even debate. On the judge's bench, Walter Grayson crossed his arms, nodding slowly. His eyes, hidden behind thick lenses, remained indifferent, but the approval in his expression was unmistakable. Everything seemed to be falling into place. A simple case, a teenage defendant, a verdict that could be delivered within minutes. But all of that was true only before Jalen spoke. Jalen defends himself, the first shock. Public defender Lisa Thornton stood up, gripping the case files tightly in her hands. She wasn't a great lawyer, or perhaps she had never handled a case where the defendant had enough legal knowledge to counter the prosecutor. "Your Honor," on behalf of the defendant. She had barely gotten halfway through her sentence, her voice still uncertain, when a gentle hand rested on her wrist. Jalen. There was no urgency, no nervousness in his touch. It wasn't a frantic interruption, but rather a calm and decisive signal. He leaned slightly toward his attorney, his voice low but firm. Let me. Lisa blinked. For a second, she hesitated, glancing at the teenager sitting beside her. A normal defendant would cling to their lawyer, relying on their legal representative for protection. But Jalen wasn't like that. There was no fear in his eyes, no sign of panic, only an unsettling, quiet confidence. Slowly, Lisa sat back down. All eyes in the courtroom turned to Jalen. The room fell silent. For a brief moment, the only sounds were the faint rustling of papers and the soft tap of a pen against the court clerk's desk. From the judge's bench, Grayson raised an eyebrow, looking down at the young man before him. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice laced with surprise and a hint of amusement. Jalen took a slow breath before lifting his head. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, unwavering. "I will defend myself." A stunned hush swept through the courtroom. Someone audibly gasped. A murmur rippled across the room. Chairs scraped against the floor as a few jurors unconsciously leaned forward, as if unsure they had heard correctly. From the corner of the room, the police officer near the door arched a brow, his grip tightening on his knee. Judge Grayson blinked, eyeing Jalen up and down as though he had just heard the most absurd thing all day. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington let out a quiet chuckle, as if he had just overheard a ridiculous joke during his lunch break. This should be interesting. A few people laughed along with him. A case that had seemed so straightforward, now featuring a teenager choosing to represent himself instead of relying on a lawyer? It was bound to be a joke. But then, Jalen opened his case file, rose to his feet, slid his hands into his pockets, and locked eyes with the prosecutor. He didn't smile. He didn't hesitate. No one was laughing anymore when Jalen began to speak. Everything was about to change, turning the officer's testimony against him, the first counterattack. The courtroom had already been quiet, but at this moment, the silence became heavier than ever. Jalen calmly turned to face Prosecutor Carrington, his gaze sharp but absent of anger. He spoke slowly, each word crisp and deliberate. "You stated that Officer Daniel Ruiz saw me sitting in the car with his own eyes, correct?" Carrington shrugged, his confidence unwavering, his voice still full of certainty. "Of course." As soon as the words left his mouth, several jurors nodded subtly, as if the officer's testimony had already sealed the case. A police officer had seen Jalen in the stolen car. End of discussion. Or at least, that's what they thought. Jalen gave a slow, thoughtful nod, as if carefully considering something. Then, he looked up, his expression steady as he locked eyes with Judge Grayson. "Then I request the GPS data from Officer Ruiz's patrol car for that night." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly. Carrington's confidence faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Judge Grayson frowned, adjusting his glasses slightly as he glanced at the prosecutor, as if curious to see how he would respond. From the spectator seats, murmurs started to ripple through the crowd. Prosecutor Carrington blinked, just once, very quickly, but it was enough to betray a brief moment of hesitation. Jalen took a step forward, his voice sharper, more certain. "I have a feeling it won't match." A wave of murmurs swept across the courtroom. The jurors leaned forward, exchanging glances. Carrington hesitated. For just 1 second. But 1 second was all Jalen needed. A truly confident prosecutor wouldn't hesitate. If the GPS data confirmed that Officer Ruiz was present at the scene, Carrington would have countered the argument immediately. But he didn't. That silence, it wasn't just a pause. It was an admission. Jalen knew it. The jury knew it. And Judge Grayson knew it. A crack had formed in the foundation of the prosecution's case. And Jalen was ready to tear it apart completely. Forensic data and fingerprints are suspected. Jalen continues to break the prosecutor's argument. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington feels the pressure, the first counterattack. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington felt the pressure mounting on him. Jalen had created a crack in the officer's testimony, but he still had one crucial piece of evidence, the fingerprint. He took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and walked to the center of the courtroom. His voice rang out with the self-assurance honed from handling hundreds of cases before. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. He swept his gaze over the jury, deliberately pausing on a few members, as if he wanted to imprint an undeniable fact into their minds. What more is there to argue? The fingerprints are there. The evidence is clear. The jury was silent. Some nodded slightly. Others exchanged looks, as if they had already made up their minds. It seemed like the final blow. But then, Jalen gently shook his head. No, no, no. You're wrong. He spoke slowly, his tone calm, giving no sign of being cornered. Jalen leaned slightly forward, his gaze locking with the jury. His voice was deep but clear, each word echoing in the quiet room. If fingerprints mean I was driving the car, then if I try on a jacket in a store, does that mean I've stolen it? The silence in the courtroom was overwhelming. A few jurors blinked, looking at each other as if suddenly awakened from a false assumption. In the back, one spectator nodded subtly, another whispered to the person next to them. On the judge's bench, Grayson narrowed his eyes, not speaking, but his gaze revealed a hint of thought. Carrington shifted slightly, but this time, he didn't rush to rebut immediately. Jalen continued, his voice steady, as though explaining a simple yet powerful principle. Think about it. How many times have you touched something without taking it? How many times have you accidentally left fingerprints somewhere you don't even remember? He took another step forward, calm, unwavering. So the real question isn't whether my fingerprints are there. It's how and why they're there. The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. Carrington, now feeling cornered, opened his file and quickly flipped through the papers as though searching for something to salvage the situation. But Jalen was ready for the next move. He calmly turned to Judge Grayson, his voice low but echoing through the courtroom. Is the forensic expert here to testify today? Grayson furrowed his brow, then glanced at Prosecutor Carrington. The room seemed to freeze. Carrington clenched his jaw, his face tense. But finally, he could only say one word. No. The silence grew tense. Jalen nodded lightly, as though confirming something. He looked directly at Carrington, then back at the jury, giving them time to reflect on what had just transpired. Interesting. From the spectator seats, someone drew a sharp breath. One juror leaned back in their chair, arms crossed, their face contemplative. Another began jotting something down in their notebook. This was no longer a simple trial. Jalen had not only questioned the forensic evidence, he had made the entire courtroom reconsider the entire case. And he wasn't done yet. The evidence overlooked, the final blow. Jalen took a deep breath and slowly pulled out a neatly folded document from the file in front of him. He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Judge Grayson. The courtroom fell into complete silence, the only sound being the soft rustling of paper as Jalen placed the document before the judge. The statement from the car owner, Raymond Whitaker. Jalen paused for a moment, then continued, his voice devoid of anger, but filled with a chilling certainty. The prosecutor hit it. Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly. He reached for the paper, scanning the words on it. For a moment, no one in the courtroom moved. Then, Grayson leaned back in his chair and set the paper down. He didn't say anything, but a slow, heavy breath escaped his lips. Jalen didn't need to wait for the judge's approval. He already knew what was on that paper. And now, everyone in the room would know. He picked up the paper, his gaze locking with the jury. The car owner was very clear. Jalen read aloud slowly, each word deliberate, allowing each sound to sink into the consciousness of everyone in the room. The thief was a white kid. The courtroom froze. A shockwave rippled through the spectators. One juror leaned forward instinctively, gripping the edge of their chair. A spectator exhaled sharply, while another whispered something to the person next to them. At the prosecutor's table, Carrington stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his hand gripping the edge of the table. The confidence in his voice, the authoritative presence he had exuded at the start of the trial, now had a visible crack. Jalen let the moment linger, allowing the truth to sink into every corner of the room. Then, he took a slow step forward toward the jury, his gaze never leaving them. Jalen didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Instead, his tone was deep, heavy as a stone. I was arrested. He paused, his eyes scanning the jury as if ensuring they truly heard what he was about to say. Because I'm a black guy walking near the scene. A long silence followed. This wasn't the usual silence of a courtroom, but a silence of realization, of awakening, of stark truth. No one laughed anymore. No one nodded along with the prosecutor. And most importantly, no one saw Jalen as a criminal anymore. At this moment, they saw someone who had been treated unjustly, and Jalen knew he had just changed the course of the trial. The end, justice served. The silence in the courtroom was no longer the usual stillness. It was the stillness of a system that had just been challenged. Judge Walter Grayson looked down at the case file in front of him. To him, this case had been meant to be a quick formality, a teenager accused of car theft, seemingly clear evidence, and a verdict almost certainly already decided. But now, everything had changed. The file still lay open on the desk, but it no longer held any meaning. Jalen hadn't just defended himself. He had dismantled every part of this case with sharp reasoning, with undeniable truth. Grayson sighed, not out of exhaustion, but in realization that he had been wrong from the start. He reached for the wooden gavel, slowly lifting it. The entire courtroom held its breath. Then, in a formal moment, he slammed it down on the desk. Case dismissed. The silence lingered for a second. Then it erupted. A wave of chatter rose from the spectator seats. Some gasped, some whispered to the person next to them, while others simply sat in stunned silence, as if unable to believe what had just happened. From the press section, reporters rushed to take notes, some pulling out their phones as if eager to update the breaking news. The jury hadn't fully reacted yet. Some looked at Jalen with admiration, while others turned to look at Prosecutor Carrington, who was now clenching his jaw, his eyes dark with fury. For Carrington, this wasn't just a defeat, it was an embarrassment. Jalen hadn't just been acquitted. He had completely shattered the prosecutor's entire argument right before everyone's eyes. And at this moment, the entire system had to take a hard look at itself. Judge Grayson remained silent. But instead of sitting upright as he had before, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and looked at Jalen with an entirely different expression. For the first time since the trial began, there was no disdain, no superiority, no contempt. Instead, there was recognition. He cleared his throat, then spoke, his voice low but clear. "You should study law." The room fell silent again. Some exchanged glances, unsure whether it was a sarcastic remark or a true recognition. But Jalen knew. He didn't need to think about it for long. A slight smile curved at the corner of his mouth, one that wasn't arrogant nor defiant, just a smile from someone who already knew the answer. "I've already planned on it." And with that, Jalen didn't wait another second. He turned, leaving the defendant's table, walking slowly but confidently toward the courtroom door. The case might have been over. But for Jalen, this was just the beginning. The conclusion, a small revolution. The trial had ended, but its echoes still resonated. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon air was heavy. A crowd had gathered, whispers filling the air, the flashes from the photographers' cameras still blinking incessantly. In the distance, Judge Walter Grayson stood silently on the sidewalk, his eyes staring into the distance, not at the crowd, nor at Jalen. He was looking back at his own past. For years, sitting on the bench, Grayson had seen countless defendants like Jalen, young men, people pushed into corners by the system, those everyone assumed were guilty simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And today, for the first time, he had to ask himself, how many people have been convicted not because of evidence, but because of prejudice? Meanwhile, Jalen stepped down the courthouse steps, quietly weaving through the crowd of reporters. He didn't run from them, but he didn't seek their attention either. He wasn't standing here to prove he was smart. He wasn't standing here to prove he was special. He stood here because he knew there were far too many people who didn't have the same opportunity he did. Today, he didn't just prove his innocence. He had made the entire system look at itself. And he knew this wouldn't be the last time he walked into a courtroom. But next time, he wouldn't stand in front of the court as a defendant. Next time, he would be a lawyer. A person fighting not only for himself, but for everyone else, the ones who never had a chance to be heard. Because justice doesn't come on its own. We have to stand up and take it. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away, take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.